had that idea. Other people have launched and are creating amazingness around that big idea. So for you, coming out and immediately hitting yourself against them competitively may not be the best idea for you with your big idea. So you need to take that big idea and knit your flipping face off. You need to identify the void. You need to find the underserved part within that big idea. You need to find what is being ignored or not being solved as a problem within that big idea, within that micro niche. Don't just niche once, don't just niche twice. You want to niche till it hurts, till you want to honestly say to yourself, but John, is there actually going to be any potential listeners in this niche? And if you got to that point, my answer is, okay, you might be onto something right now, because now you can day one dominate that niche. You can become what I like to say is the best solution to a real problem in this world. So a great example of Entrepreneurs on Fire, this is 10 years ago. So this is why this advice is even more important today. But 10 years ago, I'm like, a big idea is to launch a podcast. Niching down, how about a business podcast? Well, there's about 800 business podcasts. If I niche down again to an interview-based podcast of entrepreneurs, there were 7 shows that were doing that. So from like thousands to 800 to 7, but still, did I want to be the 8th best interview-based podcast interviewing entrepreneurs? Of course not. So I said, how can I niche down again to become the best? And I said, well, a differentiator is the quantity. So I launched the first daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. What did that make Entrepreneurs on Fire? Day one, it made it the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It made it the worst daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It was the only daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. So despite the fact that I was not good as a host, I was not good as an interviewer, it was the only game in town. And so if you wanted that type of show, that type of frequency, Entrepreneurs on Fire was the one-stop shop. So how can you become the best day one? Either that means there's no competition or really bad competition, and you get there by niching your flipping face off. The second thing, build a community around your podcast topic before you launch your podcast. And there's so many different ways to do that. And this is also going to afford you an opportunity to be putting in the reps on different platforms before your podcast goes live. Because again, we like to say, don't procrastinate launching your show, but the thing about a podcast is everybody's going back and listening to episode 1 of Entrepreneurs on Fire. And when they do that, I kind of cringe. They're like, John, I found out about your show yesterday. I just listened to episode 3743. It was great. I'm going to go back and start at episode 1 and catch up. And I'm like, well, A, you must have no life because you do nothing except listening to podcasts. God bless them. And number 2, I'm like, oh my God, they're going to go from me at 3743 as their first taste, and then go to episode 1 where I was like this like shaking little boy with like this piece of paper like crackling on the microphone because I was like trying to figure out what to say. Like that's going to be such a disparity, but it's fine. But just the point is, your podcast will live forever in that way. So why not put in some reps on Instagram, with a Facebook group, on different social media platforms, LinkedIn, like actually utilize different platforms to start talking about your topic, to start getting into the mode of being somebody who's an influencer, an expert, an authority in that space on that topic that you're going to be an expert in when it comes to your podcast. And then if you're able to, over 1, 2, 3 months, build up a small to smallish audience around that topic, all the better when you launch your podcast, because then you can alert those individuals, hey, I just launched my show. It's around all these things I've been talking about, all these different platforms. I'm doing a lot of work behind the scenes with my logo, with my intro, my outro, with this, with that. And the show's ready, it's gonna launch on this day. Come check it out. And you might have a micro audience already gathered around that, which can really help you get off on the right foot. So those 2 things, niching your flipping face off and working on building a community before your show actually launches, could be 2 great things. So moving along, because 30 minutes goes quite fast, as we both know, for those people who currently have a show, or soon will, what would be 2 growth tactics that you'd recommend?
All the ways. I feel like if you were to go into Google, you would find hundreds, thousands of articles, how to grow your podcast. And in this environment, with as many as there are, there's both so much opportunity and also quite a lot of overwhelm in even imagining it. And my favorite part of my first one is that the industry is still growing and figuring itself out. YouTube just jumped in the game. There's so many big moves still being made and small moves being made that my number one is to don't be afraid to try anything and everything. I feel like podcasting is still in this space where no single tactic is going to work for you all the time. It may work this time, it probably won't work next time. So I love the idea of getting very experimental. This is something we do on the team at Being Boss. We'll go through a quarter, we'll see what worked, what didn't work, and then we come to the table, and I call these shitty ideas. This idea that we just sit down and we just throw spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, see what sounds interesting enough to give it a go, that we're all into it, we want to see if it's going to work or not. We call this also a test and change mindset and how it is that we go about anything. So when it comes to growing, and I know this is like the worst non-answer ever, but feel empowered and encouraged to try any sort of weird idea you can come up with. Because podcasting is still in a place where I think there are some wrong things that you can do, but I don't think there is like the right thing that you can do. There's lots of opportunities, and you have also the opportunity to give a go to whatever it is that you want to try out. My next one is a little bit backwards from something I said a moment ago, and it's actually to do interviews. So I mentioned to launch, I love the idea of not doing interviews, getting in, finding your voice. But for a long time, interviews have been known as being a really great tactic for helping you grow the thing that you're doing. Once you figure out that voice and you've claimed your expertise and you've found your niche and found your space in the market of all of the podcasts, bring in some interesting people who can add some diversity to the topic that you're sharing. Get them, if they are willing, to share that podcast with their audience. There's also this really great added benefit, I think, that they're bringing in this tone that adds another layer to what it is that we have said so many times before. And it also is a stretch of processes, and is another one of those test and change things, so that you can try it out, see if you like it, and keep going. My sort of sub-tip for this, though, is to be very careful with who you do bring on, because everyone that you bring into your show adds a bit of flavor to your show, in a way that if you're not careful, you can end up going into a place that you don't want to. So be very picky. I feel like podcast pitches these days are everywhere. My inbox is filled with them all the time. I know yours is as well. And it's not about getting as many people as you can. It's about getting the right people for your show. I think it's a great tactic for growing it once you're ready for it.
So during our pre-interview chats, I did mention to Emily that I thought it would actually be pretty cool if we disagreed on one or two things. One thing that I, as an interviewer, actually do like is a little polarization, is a little controversy. Like, one of my least favorite things when I'm at a conference and there's like a panel of 4 people and one person answers the question and then the other 3 people are just like, I agree 100%. Like, to me, there's not added value there. And so what I would like to do is offer a differing opinion here, and whatever speaks to you as the audience should be the direction that you go into. Because my first tip that I want to talk about is in direct competition with Emily's second tip, which is when people come to me and say, John, I want to launch a podcast, and this is what I'm thinking about doing, I always say, it would be a big mistake if you launched an interview-based podcast with the idea of growing your show. And there's a reason for that. Entrepreneurs on Fire became an amazing success. As I mentioned, 126 million downloads to date, over 2.5 million downloads every single month, and growing. And if I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire with my 2012 skill sets and the exact same concept in 2022, that show fails. The show just fails. It won in 2012 because I was able to be the best podcast interviewing successful entrepreneurs 7 days a week, but it fails in 2022, much for the same reason, because I wouldn't be, and I wouldn't have had the time to become good at what I do before other competitors were able to kind of catch up and figure things out. So for me, when I give advice to individuals that want to launch and grow an actual podcast, I say this needs to be you, your voice, your message, your thing. Now, I'm not against occasionally bringing on a bonus guest or finding the perfect person to come on once or twice a month to interview them if it just makes sense. That can be a great addition to your show. But listen, this is your podcast. This is about you finding your voice, sharing your message and your mission with the world. And I want to give you every single opportunity to do that, to put in the reps. And one thing that I know both Emily and I have experienced being interview hosts, as we are supposed to do, when we're interviewing somebody, we take the spotlight as the host and we shine it on our guest. And that guest is highlighted as the expert, as the authority figure, as the influencer that they are, rightfully so. And with a 7-day-a-week podcast, interviewing entrepreneurs, that's all that I do. Now, I love the idea of somebody launching a show in 2022 and trying to grow that podcast to say, wait a second, I'm gonna have the spotlight on me. I am gonna be the voice, the message. I'm gonna build authority. I'm gonna build influence in this space. I'm gonna create a topic-based show. And just to add some more details to this when it comes to my opinion, the world does not need a brand new, inexperienced podcaster interviewing great guests, asking the same questions that guest has been asked 100 times, but in just possibly and probably a worse manner because that person is just getting going. That's not a way to launch a podcast and to have that gain traction, because what are you doing? What are you differentiating yourself in? Are you niching your flipping face off like I said in the previous thing? Of course not. You are just becoming a pale, weak imitation of hundreds, if not thousands, of other podcasts that are out there, and the world doesn't need that. But what the world does need is the true, genuine voice, message, mission, authority, knowledge, skill set that you have to share in a short form topic-based podcast, a season, a series, or so on and so forth. So I highly encourage people to launch topic-based shows. And going back to Emily's earlier points, I love saying, hey, just try a season, just try a series, do 10 episodes, then walk away, see how that feels, see how that percolates, and then go from there. The second thing is a truism that I've realized very clearly over the years, is that podcast listeners listen to podcasts. So podcast listeners listen to podcasts. So knowing that truth, it makes so much sense for people like myself and Emily and other people who have podcasts to find podcasts in their niche, in their area of expertise, and pitch themselves to become guests on that show. Because now when I, the host of Entrepreneurs on Fire, am a guest on a business-based podcast about entrepreneurship, and I hopefully go on there and deliver great value and give people some great takeaways and content, and at the end of the show, I'm like, hey, I hope you enjoyed this. If you're a podcast listener, I know the average podcast listener listens to 7 podcasts. I don't want you to stop listening to Being Boss, but I want to become one of your 7. So if you want to check out Entrepreneurs on Fire, it's a daily podcast interviewing the world's most successful entrepreneurs, 7 days a week. I've got a back catalog of over 3,700 episodes. Come check it out, eofire.com. And me doing that on a repetitive basis, I book time every single month, one day. I do 10 to 15 back-to-back interviews on other shows. That's the one day that I book out to do that. And I know that that is worth my time because, again, podcast listeners listen to podcasts. So everybody listen to that podcast, they have the podcast app on their phone. They're listening to Spotify or Apple or Google or iHeart or one of those podcasting apps that they're listening to right now. And that's an amazing, targeted, perfect avatar / listener for myself. So my two tactics there, topic-based shows and podcast guesting. And it's a great opportunity, by the way, if you have a podcast, to reach out to somebody who has a podcast that you want to be a guest on and say, hey, I love your show. I think I'd be a great guest on your show. And by the way, let me return the value to you by having you as a guest on my show. Let's do a podcast swap. We can book an hour. I'll do 30 minutes on your show, you do 30 minutes on mine. We'll both get exposure to each other's audiences. And now instead of you just saying, can I have this? You're giving a value proposition. You're giving a value swap. That can be a great way for you to get on a lot more shows because now you have something of value to give to that podcast host as well. So that can be a great little reason for you to have your podcast. Now we're going to move into the next section, which is success. Why, Emily? Why did your podcast become a success?
Oh, I feel like so many really good reasons, right? You can really hype yourself up when being asked this question. But it's actually, I think, relatively simple. This goes back a little bit to the niching idea that you gave earlier. Whenever I launched the Being Boss podcast with my previous co-host in 2015, we were the only women in the business charts that was a pair of women talking about business. So that's not, much of a niche really, but when that was what the market looked like, it really was. I think where the magic really happened though is in the chemistry that my co-host and I had together. These were topics that we had been talking about amongst ourselves for years prior to launching the show. And you may think about that for yourself. If you were to get together with friends, or your colleagues, the things that you are going to be gabbing about the entire time is likely going to be really great fodder for the show that you're wanting to launch for yourself. That's what we did. And we went into this space with a really fresh perspective on business. Our dream listener is a creative business owner or a creative entrepreneur. They're artists and yogis and interior designers, and they just want to work for themselves. And we were talking about business in a way that they could understand. They didn't have MBAs, they had never taken a business course. Most of them just started this business on a whim and found themselves in it, but needed to understand a lot of the important business terms or business things they needed to do to make this thing work for themselves. And my co-host Kathleen and I showed up and we were having these conversations about profit margins and marketing tactics in a way that really connected with our audience. It was really engaging stuff for them, and especially at a time when our competitors looked a lot more like John than they did like me. And it was, I think that's one of the things that really fed into our success. Really on-point content for our people and really great chemistry with my co-host.
So as we slide into our 2-minute countdown here, I want to just kind of reiterate something that I shared earlier, but is definitely the reason why I was successful, obviously why Emily was successful, and we actually run the biggest podcasting community in the world, Podcasters Paradise, so I'm seeing this on a daily basis with members that are joining who are launching and growing their podcast. This is what's working for them and having them be successful, and what's not working for them is saying, oh, this show's successful, that show's successful, I'm going to just copy that show and try to ride on those coattails and try to become a similar version of success. That goes back to what I shared earlier. Nobody wants a pale, weak imitation of somebody else. What they want is the real, true, authentic version of you and the value that you can give. And if you can find a way to knit your flipping face off and become the number one solution to a real problem in this world, you will win. Now, I know that sounds kind of difficult. How am I going to become the number one solution to a real problem in this world? Well, the problem is on your side. You're not niching enough because there is a problem that is not being solved within your area of expertise, within your knowledge bank, within your passion and excitement and enthusiasm sets. there is a problem that's not being solved. And you can be that person, because people, they will beat a path to the doorstep for the number one solution to a real problem that they have. And they will ignore the second best solution all the way to eternity. So please, if you take anything away from our conversation, become the number one solution to a real problem in this world. This has been Emily Thompson from Being Boss, John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire. Thank you for your time today, and have a wonderful time at Inbound 2022.